for this webinar on supporting literacy development at home, presented by Grove's literacy expert, Ellen Engstrom. Before we get started, I would like to introduce myself and share about upcoming opportunities for families to engage with Groves. Then I'll review a few housekeeping items and introduce you to our presenter. My name is Linda Roslansky, and I get to be the Director of Outreach at Groves Learning Organization. I have the great pleasure of working alongside our Learning Center and admissions teams. We have many events to engage with GLOW and explore our Academy and Learning Center. Our first open house of the school year will be on November 12th, where you can meet our new head of school, Jessie Coyle, hear from parents and students, and tour our beautifully newly renovated school. We have multiple GLOW Education Series events coming up as well, and all of that is on our website. To help us stay on schedule, your camera and microphone have been turned off. Our speaker will take questions at the end of the presentation. Please use the chat function to submit those questions, and you will notice the chat feature and the chat bubbles at the top of your screen, and you can click on those to enter the questions, and I will help moderate those to help us stay on track. Now, I am very pleased to introduce our expert presenter. Ellen received her BA from Wellesley College. She received an MA in Education from the University of Rochester and her MA in Educational Psychology from the University of Minnesota. She is a certified dyslexia therapist and a trainer, and has been a teacher in public and independent schools as well as in college. She was a lead education specialist in the Landmark College for Research and Training before serving as Director of Education and Director of Curriculum at Groves Academy. Her commitment to education and expertise in literacy has made a significant impact on the lives of many, and I'm honored to introduce Ellen Engstrom. So I'm going to turn it over to Ellen, and we are set to go. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Linda, and welcome everybody to this webinar. I am pleased to be able to talk to you about supporting reading development at home, and to let you know a little bit about what we know through our all the science and research that has gone into understanding reading and the development of reading over the last number of years. And so, basically, Marianne Wolf, who's a cognitive scientist who's done lots of research and speaking on this topic, says reading never just happens. It is important to note that reading that human brains did not evolve to be able to make humans able to read. It is something that develops out of spoken language and uses some of the same neurocircuitry to develop the capacity for reading. And as this diagram shows, there are definite phases, I should say, toward that lead to the ability to match symbols to sounds and read fluently, which we'll be exploring. So after birth, about 6 to 8 months, the brain is beginning its journey to read, although it's earlier than we ever used to think. So any amount of time that a child of this age spends listening to parents read to them, talk to them, is a good predictor of reading achievement. And, the child associates being loved with the act of reading. So having a child sit on your lap while you look at a book is a wonderful activity and prepares children for the fact that reading is a loving activity. And then as we move into the 9-month to 18-month range, the child begins to recognize visual images. And begins to really understand pictures. And you see, the baby on the slide is staring at itself in a mirror and having a wonderful time looking at itself there. So the visual system in the brain is pretty functional at 6 months of age. The attentional system will not develop until much, much later. The conceptual part of the brain grows by leaps and bounds each day. The ability to attend and focus is a late developing cognitive ability, but visual and concepts are coming into play. So by the time we get to 18 months old, the things have names. Children can connect 2 or more systems to make representations in the brain. So suddenly the content of the book is a much bigger deal in shaping language development. And I cannot stress too much the importance of spoken language, oral language, spoken language, because reading develops out of our already developed language ability. So the more a child is spoken to, the more she can understand oral language, and the more she's able to glean meaning from the oral language. And of course, it also develops vocabulary. So this is all way before she's going to read, but it's a very active part of child development and language and literacy development. Now, in early childhood, there are some actual systems that develop in the brain. One of them is the phonological system, which is recognizing that words are made up of sounds. That that PHON, phone, is from the Greek language, which means sound. So phonological, phonograph, telephone, all of those have to do with sound. Another system that's developing now is semantic, recognizing that words have meanings and paying attention to those meanings. And it is through that process that vocabulary growth occurs. And the other system is the syntactic, which means grammatical relationships are important. So the word order in a sentence is becoming noticeable and important. So for example, the example we have here is the cat bit the mouse means something very different than the mouse bit the cat. And children begin to attend to that syntax and that relationship from word to word. At this point, oral language and cognition or thinking and written language are coming together. At this point, children learn probably 2 to 4 new words each day, not written words, but words in our oral language, in our spoken language. So environment plays a huge part in brain development, and the research that's gone on over the past 25, 35 years or so has really emphasized that. So we know that reading to children leads to phonological development. In other words, the ability to hear sounds within words. Vocabulary development as children begin to pay attention to words and their meaning. And then they also begin to understand the relationships between words in sentences. And the other thing that can happen through reading is some emotional development, because you understand another person's perspective. So and I have the symbols of frog and toad here at the bottom of the page, which was certainly one of my children's favorite books, but it represents a friendship where people understand each other, and frog and toad are different, but they're able to be friends and they're able to have empathy for one another. So print awareness comes along as children move toward formal schooling, kindergarten, first grade, etc., because now, in addition to spoken language and understanding how words work in spoken language, they now have to become aware of how words in print function. So the ability to name letters is one good predictor of reading readiness. And of course, they have to be exposed to the letters and their names in order to develop that awareness. So they also have to learn that printed words can go in a particular direction. So, for example, English goes from left to right, although Hebrew and Aramaic words go from right to left. Asian words are read from top to bottom, and so there's a number of ways that print words can be arranged. In our case, the English and German and Romance languages and so on are all left to right. So that's very common. When you're reading and looking at books with children, it is a nice thing to do, a helpful thing to do, to ask children, to name letters, because if you can name the letter, eventually you can match it with its sound. And that's why we encourage that. So brain changes are massive between birth and 7 years old. But interestingly, by the time a child reaches 7 years old, they have about 95% of the brain capacity that they will have as an adult. But the brain has to rearrange itself as literacy develops. It is a well-known fact about human brains, which that they have the quality of what's called plasticity, which means that the neurons in the brain can become specialized if they are asked to do so. So in the visual cortex, they need to become specialized to pay attention to images, to pay attention to words, to pay attention and for focus and so on. And the neurons, in order to be functional, have to become what's called myelinated, which means there's a layer of myelin, or a kind of a fatty substance, that secures the neural connections. And actually that happens between ages of 5 to 7. And it tends to be a little later in boys, but not necessarily. And we often talk about, developing executive function skills and how that doesn't happen until way later. And myelination doesn't happen until, kids are in their 20s or something. But in this case, we're looking at neural networks and neurons that become myelinated much earlier than that. So when that myelination occurs, then the neurological readiness for reading is available to the child. And so I just want to show you how a non-dyslexic brain or neurotypical brain processes language and reading. So here we have the left side of the brain, and we have in the back of the brain, which seems sort of counterintuitive since we see out of the front, is we have the occipital lobe, and that is responsible for recognizing letters, visual recognition of letters. And then in the middle of the brain, we have an area that's known as Wernicke's area, which processes the meanings of sounds and words so you understand what's being heard. And then in the front of the brain is an area known as Broca's area. That's the area that processes the sounds of language to create speech. So we have these three very important areas. And here in the and in your occipital lobe, that's the visual letter identification, CAT. The meaning of this slide might be slightly strange. Let me just see. Whoop. Okay. Yeah, the cat really, and I apologize for this, the cat really belongs up here with Wernicke's area because that's where the meaning of the sounds and the words is processing is happening. And the occipital lobe sees the letters. The Wernicke's area says, oh yeah, right, cat. That's that furry thing that goes meow. Broca's areas processes the sounds in cat, which would be k, eh, t, right. So the connections between these three areas develop over time until they become extremely fast. So there's a lot of connectivity here, which allows for ultimately fluent reading, which will occur eventually. And I should add that explanation of the connectivity in the brain, that's a pretty simplified version. But if I tried to explain it to you the way a neurologist would, I think we'd all probably close our eyes and take a nap. So I don't want to do that to you. Then one of the first things that has to happen is that children have to develop an awareness of sounds, that words are made up of sounds and how those sounds work. So there's a variety, there's a whole number of stages in that development. And that we are going to talk about. So it's one of the things, phonemic awareness and building phonemic awareness is very, very much, let's see, phonemic awareness is really the first thing that has to, in the process of learning to read. However, when you're reading stories and poems to children, and you're also giving them language-rich experiences, then things like rhyme, repetition, reading things over and over. And you notice if you read a children's book, there's a lot of repetition. And it's kind of sing-songy and it's kind of fun. And eventually the child knows it better than you do. And it's all useful. And then alliteration is when you use the same sound in the word. Sam the snake slid south across the sand. And then also assonance, which is basically a lot of rhyming put all together. Funny bunny, you're a funny bunny, honey. Ugh. And all of those things exist, you know, in the books that we read children. So how do we develop sound awareness? We have to recognize the individual sounds and words, but that goes in a certain order. So the first thing would be to work on the first sound in a word. So here the cartoon character, the mom is saying, what's the first sound in van? And the child can say, v. That's the beginning. Beginning sounds of words are the start of this process of recognizing all the sounds in words. And then you can also recognize the same sounds in different words. So if we ask a child, what sound is the same in the words fix, fall, and fun? And the child can say, F. That's terrific. That's progress. And then if you can recognize the sound that doesn't belong, bus, bun, rug. And what's different? Rug, because it doesn't begin with a B. That's recognition of a sequence and a different sound, and knowing what that different sound is. Then other things that we can do to prepare, in the way of developing awareness of sounds in words is to ask students to listen to a word, like, for example, the word seat, and then say seat, seat. Now say seat again, but this time don't say s, and it will be eat. Now we can do that, and that can become very challenging and so on, but it is it's a good sign when children can manipulate the sounds in spoken words, like dropping them, changing them around, things of that nature. So then the next thing that comes along is going to be letter sound associations. So we have our alphabet, which has 26 letters and 42 sounds, depending on who you're talking to. It's important to know, for a child to be able to map or meld the sound of a letter with the letter itself. So we start by just having students know the sound, the most common sound for all the consonants. We introduce consonant digraphs, which means we have letters like SH says sh, not s, and CH is ch, not s, k, or ch, k, ch, k. I'm having a hard time breaking them apart. TH, CK, k, and WH. We are working, and then we work on and introduce, usually first we introduce the short vowels, which is a, I, and e. And that seems to be a common practice, which is interesting because we don't actually usually introduce long vowels, the vowels that say their name, until a little bit later. And that partly has to do with the fact that long vowels, there are rules around how to make a long vowel, but not so much with short vowels. And moving along. So the thing is that's so important about words and teaching words, exposure to words, is that if a child grows up in an environment where words are not heard a lot, then they don't tend to learn concepts. So when sentences, syntactic forms like a sentence, they don't encounter that, then they have less knowledge about how the relationships in a story work. If you don't know the forms of stories, then you have less ability to predict outcomes, to read between the lines and have some consequences and so on. And then if cultural traditions are never experienced, there's less understanding of how other people might feel. And in fact, we know from some really very good research that children who grow up in a little in a world where people talk to them, read to them, engage with them, which would be a more rich literacy world. They start kindergarten with quite a lot of words, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 or so. And whereas children who are in an environment where they're not exposed to language a lot, they're not particularly exposed to written language, then they have fewer vocabulary words. They may start kindergarten with half the words that a child has who has been in an enriched literacy environment. By the time those two children get to become seniors in high school in 12th grade and graduate, the gap between the higher enriched literacy environment child and the child with fairly low literacy exposure, the enriched literacy child is going to know 4 times the number of words as the child who grows up in a low literacy. So language is so important. Oral spoken language is so important for developing vocabulary and the ability to use language. Okay, let's see. So, how can you tell if your preschooler might have difficulty learning to read? Well, one concern is when the development of speech occurs, because if that's late, and there's a wide range, if development of speech is late, that can indicate some concerns about how language is processed in the child's brain. Another sign may be if the child has trouble remembering the names of objects, because another, quick retrieval of names is another good sign for the ability to attend to speech and know things automatically. When the child has trouble learning letter names or remembering the letters in their own name, so on, then that's a sign of some concern, which may indicate the need for some additional support in literacy. If they have trouble rhyming, or particularly if they can't recognize the beginning sounds of words in the series of words, that's another sign that phonemic awareness is not developing at the pace that you might like. The other sign is difficulty with remembering directions or what was just said. Now, that can be caused by attention, and these, attentional issues and literacy challenges, when they're combined, it's hard to tell what is causing what. But these are things that are worth paying attention to. So now, science tells us a lot about how children learn to read and spell. And so here's another picture of a brain where you can see where in the brain certain crucial activities or abilities developed in the brain. So in the frontal lobe, we have the speech sounds, the input and output. And in what's called the parietal lobe, or the temporal lobe, excuse me, is where language comprehension occurs. Then over here in the occipital lobe and toward the rear of the temporal lobe, we have letter word recognition. And word analysis and the sound and symbol connection, which is so important to be able to read, is basically coming from both the parietal and the temporal lobe. So you can see it's complicated, and but it's also very achievable with with support and exposure to language and reading and so on. So the process of learning to read is, again, is a multi-component affair. So the phonemic awareness that we talked about is essential to being able to attach the sounds to specific letters, and to eventually learn how to decode words and also encode them, which is spelling. The encoding part, or spelling, is something that's sometimes overlooked when teachers are working with children, but it's an extremely important and valuable component, or that should be in literacy development, because that's where you really learn whether children are able to listen to sounds and then connect them to the letters that represent them. And so we also have phonics, phonemic awareness, which leads to good ability to understand how sounds and letters work together. We want them to have, between this, by developing phonics, we develop good and very automatic word recognition. We also develop fluency, because if we recognize words well, we can read accurately and with some speed, enough speed to help comprehension. And then, of course, the morphology, which has to do with the parts of a word, such as suffixes, prefixes, and things like that, which are very important to English, which is actually what we call a morphophonetic language. It's phonetic, but it also has a lot of morphologic components to it. Now, this slide actually gives you an idea, compares what brain, if you did a scan, and scientists now do lots of them, if you did a scan of the brain in a reader who is developing as expected, sort of neurotypical, as we say, what you would see is those three areas that we talked about: the occipital lobe, Wernicke's area, and Broca's area, are all there on the left side of the brain, and they would be lit up because they would be, the neurons would be moving electrical currents through the, from one of these areas to another, and it would be going very fast. So you would see all this activity. Now, in a student who is impaired, maybe has a diagnosis of dyslexia, you're going to see a different scan. So here on the left, you see activity toward the front, but Wernicke's area and the occipital lobe area, the word form area, and so on, are not lighting up. Instead, we see that we've got some electrical activity over here on the right side of the brain while trying to read, But the right side of the brain does not have the capabilities to manage skilled reading. The right side of the brain is really good at a lot of other things, images, um, music, athletics, so on, but not particularly reading. So you see this, you see how they vary. The good news is that we also know that children who children who are having reading struggles, they get when they get interventions that are, that follow the um, uh, the science of reading, which we have a pretty good idea now based on research and measuring outcomes uh, of reading instruction that's based on the science of reading, that this impaired brain, after a certain amount of intervention with a quality and science-based reading instruction intervention program, is going to look a lot more like the non-impaired reader. And that's what is really amazing about this, is that we can develop, remediate students so that they really their brains appear more like non-impaired readers. The only thing that suffers is that here in the word form area, that little yellow dot that you are seeing, that has to do with the speed of word recognition. That develops at a certain point in time, and that's one thing that we cannot recreate through instruction. So students who have dyslexia are usually going to be slower readers. They may be very effective readers, but it's going to be slower, which is why we have accommodations which give students more time to do their work, and so on, because their brains are not quite as efficient as at dealing with printed words and text as someone without impairment or dyslexia. So I want to talk before we end here about reading at home, because reading at home, once children are in school and so on, is really a wonderful thing to do for the child and for you. But I also hear a lot from parents that it can be really challenging, that children maybe not want to do it. And yet we know, frankly, one of the golden door to reading fluency is having a lot of practice reading out loud. So how do you make that the best experience as possible? One is to choose a text that children can read maybe 80% of it accurately, maybe 75 to 80. But don't choose a text that's just really difficult and you're constantly having to read the words and so on. You want that child to have, a pretty good experience with oral reading. Now, the child can read out loud 15 minutes per day is really great. We know there's good research that shows that oral reading for 15 minutes a day really makes a big difference and can play a part in rising the number of words per minute that children can read accurately, which is certainly what we want. Now, you as the adult or supporter of this, if the child hits a word that they don't know or is struggling with it, just give the child a word. Don't try to make them sound it out or whatever, because it just may be too difficult. And we also want to mimic the experience of just reading, the pleasure of reading a bunch of text fairly fluently. So give the word to the child if they don't read it themselves. And if the child asks you for a definition of a word that they don't know, explain that. But otherwise, let the child read with as little interruption as possible until he or she, they have finished reading. Because we want this to be a pleasant experience. We don't want a lot of frustration. And this approach it generally has worked really well. I've read many studies on it. At this point, I am ready to take some questions if there are any. And so I will see what Linda has to say.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. That was fantastic. It was very informative, and I definitely enjoyed learning along with everybody. There are a few questions, and we would love to encourage if anybody has any now. Feel free to enter them into the chat. If you missed the first part, click on the chat bubbles at the very top, and you can type in your question. But I have a few for you. As technology has advanced, many people read books from e-readers. Is it better to read with your child from an actual book, or is there not much of a difference between books and e-readers?
That is a great question. Certainly. Thank you for bringing that up because e-readers are a big part of our lives now. For a young child, it's nice to have a book that you can hold and there are pictures there and so on. I think it's good to expose children to reading actual books on some level to know that, everything doesn't actually come on a screen.
Mhm.
I don't think that it's harmful if you have a good e-reader and there are pictures and things on it. The advantage to e-readers is that with digital text, you can make the text bigger or smaller and so on, which can be helpful depending on any kind of visual issues. In general, we know that reading digital text is different from reading text in an actual book with paper and so on. The reason is that people have a tendency to skim when they're reading online. And online text has a tendency it's particularly good for, informative text and so on. Over time, we need to make sure that students are putting in place some monitoring of their comprehension and making sure that they are not just skimming stuff. Because we do know that comprehension can be compromised if students are reading on a screen and they're not prompted to review, rehearse, take, and process the information on the screen. For myself, certainly I grew up without screens until I was an adult. I have found that, for reading for pleasure, novels and things like that, I really do like my Kindle and my iPad. However, when I'm reading for work and any professional stuff, which tends to be more detailed and dense, I really need to read it on paper and take notes and things like that. However, screens aren't going away, and we have to learn to live with them.
That's really, really helpful, Ellen. I see another one just popped up. Are there any great storytelling ideas, games, or similar for the dinner table? They're interested in utilizing that time of being together for learning from parents as models and learning from the kids too. So yeah, any ideas or games that could be shared while eating dinner together?
I have to admit, I'm not sure I'm not sure about that. I do know I have a friend who who has a set of cards. I don't know if any of you have ever listened to the Moth. That's MOTH, which is a storytelling web program. So people actually, they have open mics and people tell personal stories. And there are some cards that the Moth puts out that gives you prompts that you can just orally tell a story. Something like that could be fun if children, I don't know if it's young enough for some children. Otherwise, just talking and phrasing, drawing out anything children say using question words like what happened and who was involved and when did it happen and where did it happen and how did it happen, why, and what do you think? Sort of questions might be helpful.
That's fantastic. That was a great question. And I love the idea of that storytelling time at dinner. We have another one here. Can you share some tips for reading to your young child when they don't want to sit still or don't seem to be interested?
Yeah, that's challenging. I guess it depends on how young the child is. If the child is not able to focus, you don't want to turn. The one thing you don't want to do is turn it into a power struggle, because that will, that will go against what you're trying to do. I think personally, I think that you can start by, by reading for a very small amount of time and then provide maybe something that could be seen as a little reward of some sort. And I'm not saying candy, but children do like rewards. And then see if you can gradually increase the amount of time, and also really try to figure out, if you have a child that wants to read Dog Man and you are sick and tired of Dog Man, or Where's Waldo, or any of those things that just have endless, stick with it. It's hard. You think, I don't think the walls know it now, I don't, but children love that. And it is reading, and they're hearing a story, and there's something comforting about hearing it over again and telling your parent that you just skipped a page, which you might have done because you can't stand to read it one more time anyway. But my advice is, try to make it short and pleasant. And if they love something, it's okay that they want to read, Dog Man and not The Hobbit, for example. And, and it's okay. They're going to be fine.
Oh, I love that. It's bringing back memories. And I know, my boys are all grown now. And some of my favorite memories from when they were young was the time we spent reading together. That really was,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think that's all for our questions. Thank you, Ellen, so much for taking the time to present today. I really appreciated the tips you shared. Something as simple as just talking with your child when they're young makes a bigger impact than I would have ever imagined. Also, having the kid name some of the letters while reading, I loved hearing about that. And it sounds like that could be a great way to help keep them engaged before they can actually read the words too. So thank you so much for sharing that. And then to those who all attended, thank you so much for joining us today. This presentation will be shared with you via email in the next few days and also posted on our website. Please share this information with your family and friends. And we're just so grateful to be a community resource, and we encourage you to reach out if we can be of support. We hope to see you all at our webinar next week on supporting your anxious child with Dr. Catherine Hecht. We hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. So thank you all for attending.